In 1194, the town of Chartres, France, caught fire. Not a small fire. The kind that erases a city. Street by street, building by building, the flames moved through until almost nothing was left standing. The cathedral, one of the most important religious structures in all of France, was presumed lost. They didn't go back to look for 3 days. The heat was too intense. The smoke too thick. But when they finally walked through the ruins, they found something that would redirect the entire course of medieval construction. The sacred relic housed inside the cathedral, a piece of cloth said to have belonged to the Virgin Mary, had survived. Untouched. Not a single scorch mark. The medieval chroniclers recorded the reaction as unanimous. This was a sign. Not just a religious sign. A mandate. Build something worthy of what has been preserved. What followed was one of the most extraordinary engineering achievements in human history. A building so precisely constructed that modern acoustic scientists have spent decades trying to explain why it produces the effects it does. Not spiritual effects. Not metaphorical effects. Physiological ones. And when I finally found the answer, it had almost nothing to do with religion. I came to this through an unusual entrance. A friend of mine is an audiologist, someone who studies how sound interacts with the human body at a clinical level. We were having an unremarkable conversation one afternoon when she mentioned something offhand that I couldn't let go of. She said that certain stone buildings, particularly the very old ones, produce frequencies that modern concert halls specifically try to replicate. Frequencies in a range that measurably affects heart rate, breathing patterns, and brainwave activity. I asked her which buildings she was referring to. She named 4. 3 of them were Gothic cathedrals. The 4th was a Neolithic stone circle in Scotland. I spent the next 8 months trying to understand what connected them. What I found wasn't mysticism. It was engineering. And once I understood the engineering, I understood why the history we were taught left it out almost entirely. The word cathedral comes from the Latin cathedra, meaning seat, or chair. Specifically, the bishop's chair. The official history tells us cathedrals were built as expressions of religious devotion. Houses of worship. Monuments to faith. And they were all of those things. But they were also something the official history almost never mentions. They were hospitals. Not in a metaphorical sense. Not in a poetic sense. In a direct, physical, documented sense. And the word itself contains a clue most people walk past without noticing. The Latin root cath comes from the Greek katharion, meaning to cleanse, or to purify. The same root that gives us catharsis. The emotional and physical purging that Aristotle described when he watched tragedy performed in the theater. The ancient world did not separate these concepts the way we do. Purification of the body and purification of the mind were understood as the same process, achieved through the same means. The great Gothic cathedrals of Europe, Notre Dame, Chartres, Cologne, Canterbury, Salisbury, were not built by faith alone. They were built by guilds. And the guilds that built them were not simply stonecutters following a bishop's instructions. They were organizations that held knowledge which has only partially survived to the modern era. Knowledge about geometry. About acoustics. About the behavior of light through colored glass. And about how all of these elements, working together, could produce measurable, repeatable effects in the human nervous system. The stonemasons who built these structures were called Freemasons. Free, because they worked with freestone. A fine-grained limestone or sandstone that could be cut in any direction. Responsive. Precise. Capable of tolerances that rougher rubble stone could never achieve. But the freedom in that name meant something else too. They moved between cities. Between countries. Carrying their technical knowledge with them, beholden to no single lord, no single bishop, no single crown. The craft guilds of medieval Europe operated under a system of knowledge transfer that had no equivalent before or since. 7-year apprenticeships. Strict standards for what could be built and how it could be priced. A body of technical knowledge passed directly, person to person, generation to generation, that was never fully written down. That last part matters enormously. We'll come back to it. Here is what acoustic researchers found when they began studying these buildings seriously. And I want to be careful here, because this is where the official story and the physical evidence begin to diverge in ways that are genuinely difficult to ignore. The reverberation time inside Chartres Cathedral, the time it takes for a sound to decay by 60 decibels after the source stops, is approximately 5 seconds. That is not unusual for a large stone structure. What is unusual is the frequency distribution of that reverberation. The cathedral doesn't amplify sound equally across all frequencies. It specifically amplifies the range between 40 and 60 Hz. That is an extremely low frequency. Below the range of most musical instruments. You don't really hear it in the conventional sense. You feel it. It also happens to be, according to neuroscience research published in the last 2 decades, the frequency range associated with the theta state of brain activity. A state associated with deep relaxation, reduced cortisol production, and in clinical settings, measurable pain reduction. The building wasn't just beautiful. It was measurably altering the neurochemistry of every person inside it. Dr. Rupert Till at the University of Huddersfield has spent over a decade studying the acoustics of ancient and medieval structures. His research on Stonehenge demonstrated that the original stone configuration would have produced standing waves, creating what he describes as a disorienting, reality-altering effect, one that ancient peoples likely understood as sacred or transformative. His work on Gothic cathedrals found similar evidence of intentional engineering. The flying buttress, which every architecture student learns was invented to allow thinner walls and larger windows, also functions as an acoustic deflector. It channels sound waves back into the interior in ways that create the specific low-frequency profile these buildings produce. This was not accidental. Medieval builders did not have oscilloscopes. They did not have frequency analyzers. But they had something equally powerful: centuries of empirical observation. Generations of builders who had watched human beings respond to different stone configurations and refined their designs accordingly. The knowledge was held in the guild. Not in any text. Act 5, The Light. The stained glass deserves its own examination. The official history tells us it was didactic. It told biblical stories to an illiterate population. This is true. But the glass did something else simultaneously, something that has only been confirmed through modern material science. The specific pigments used in medieval stained glass produce a light spectrum inside the building that is fundamentally different from natural daylight. The red glass of Gothic cathedrals, produced using copper oxide, transmits light in a range that measurably affects serotonin production. The blue glass, produced with cobalt, transmits frequencies associated with melatonin regulation. We know this now because we have spectrometers. The medieval glaziers knew it through the same empirical observation that guided the stonemasons. They had watched human beings respond to this light for generations. They refined the recipes accordingly. The building was operating on multiple physiological systems simultaneously. Sound. Light. Chemistry. Speaking of chemistry, there is a Bulgarian researcher named Ion Zaidarov who spent 30 years studying the chemical composition of incense used in Orthodox Christian services. His findings, published in 2008 in the FACEB journal, showed that burning frankincense resin activates a protein called TRPV3 in the human nervous system, producing effects that are measurably anxiolytic, meaning it reduces anxiety, and analgesic, meaning it reduces pain. The Church had been burning frankincense in enclosed stone spaces for over 1,000 years before this was confirmed chemically. They didn't know about TRPV3. But they knew what happened to people who breathed it in a reverberant stone space, filtered through colored light, for an hour. They had been watching it happen since the cathedrals were first built. Now here is where the history becomes uncomfortable. The dissolution of the monasteries, carried out by Henry VIII between 1536 and 1541, is usually taught as a religious and political event. Which it was. But it was also an economic event of staggering proportions. Henry seized somewhere between a quarter and a third of all land in England. He dissolved not just the monasteries but the entire infrastructure that supported them, the craft guilds, the hospices, the almshouses, the systems of care for the sick and the poor that had operated continuously for centuries. The historian Eamon Duffy, in his exhaustive study of the English Reformation, documented what actually disappeared. Not just the monks. Not just the religious ceremonies. The hospitals. England had approximately 500 religious hospitals operating in 1530. By 1550, fewer than 50 remained. In the space of 20 years, 90% of the existing medical infrastructure of an entire nation was destroyed. This is the part one keep returning to. The cathedrals and the monastic complexes were not merely spiritual centers. They were the primary medical institutions of medieval Europe. The records that survived, and many were deliberately destroyed or allowed to decay, document herbal gardens that cultivated hundreds of medicinal species. Dormitories where the sick were housed. Sophisticated systems for moving clean water through the complex for sanitation. Dietary practices based on observation accumulated across generations. And at the center of the healing complex, always, the cathedral itself. The building where sound, light, chemistry, and geometric proportion work together to produce a physiological response that modern science is only now beginning to fully measure. The suppression of the guilds didn't happen only in England. It happened across Europe over 2 centuries, accelerating through the 16th and 17th centuries as the nation-state consolidated its power over territory, currency, and labor. The Edict of Turgot in France, in 1776, just 13 years before the Revolution, abolished the guild system entirely. In England, the Statute of Artificers, which had regulated apprenticeships and wage rates since 1563, was dismantled piece by piece through the early 19th century. The final apprenticeship clauses were repealed in 1814. The Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 made it illegal for workers to organize collective bargaining arrangements. One by one, the legal frameworks that allowed the guilds to function were removed. And with them went the knowledge systems they carried. Here is the pattern that is difficult to explain away. The suppression of the guilds and the rise of industrial wage labor happened simultaneously with the transformation of what cathedrals were understood to be. The buildings themselves didn't change. But their function did. The monastic hospitals were gone. The craft guilds that understood the acoustic and optical engineering were gone. The craft guilds that understood the acoustic and optical engineering were gone. What remained was the shell of the building, pressed into service as a purely religious institution, its healing function quietly removed from the official story. By the 19th century, when historians were writing the accounts we still largely rely on today, the idea that a stone building could produce measurable physiological effects would have seemed like superstition. These were men of the industrial age. They believed in machines and wages and observable mechanics. The idea that medieval builders had understood something about the human nervous system that their own era had lost was not a narrative that fit the story of progress. So it was not included. The same decades that saw the suppression of the guilds also saw the first stirrings of the patent system, a legal framework that transformed knowledge from a communal, guild-held resource into private property. The English Statute of Monopolies in 1624 is generally described as a landmark in intellectual property law. It was also, from another angle, the beginning of the legal apparatus that made it impossible to operate the way the guilds had operated. To hold knowledge collectively. To transmit it through apprenticeship. To refuse disclosure to anyone outside the organization. The Carpenters' Company of Philadelphia refused Thomas Jefferson access to their rule book in 1817. By then, that refusal was almost nostalgic. The legal world being built around them was systematically eliminating the conditions that made such collective knowledge possible. That I think about the people who built Chartres. They raised a structure in 26 years that has stood for 8 centuries. The nave is 121 feet high. The walls are almost entirely glass, held in place by stone ribs and flying buttresses that still function without modern reinforcement. The building survived 2 world wars, multiple revolutions, and centuries of French weather. When modern engineers have studied it, they have found tolerances in the stonework that rival 20th century construction standards. The builders didn't have computers. They didn't have laser levels. They had geometry, passed down through the guild. Practical knowledge, accumulated over centuries. And they built something that measurably changed the state of every human body that entered it, through sound, through light, through chemistry, through proportions that the nervous system registers even when the conscious mind does not. My audiologist friend visited Chartres last year. She brought a portable decibel meter and a frequency analyzer. She stood in the nave for 20 minutes, measuring. Then she put down the equipment and sat in one of the wooden chairs and didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally came out, she said, "Whatever they were doing, it works." The chair was solid and heavy and very old and still perfectly level. And the questions remain. Why do the acoustic properties of a building constructed in the 12th century match the specifications a modern neurologist would design if asked to engineer an optimal environment for pain reduction and stress relief? Why was the knowledge of how to produce these effects held inside a guild system that was systematically dismantled by the same government simultaneously centralizing control over currency, land, and labor? Why do we describe the result as a church, and not as what the acoustic measurements confirm it actually was? A machine for healing. One we no longer know how to build. Not because we lack the tools. We have tools they never imagined. We lost it because we dismantled the knowledge system that made it possible. The 7-year apprenticeship that transmitted empirical observation across generations. The guild that held the accumulated understanding of how materials behaved, how sound moved through stone, how light changed across seasons, the connection between builder and building that came from a lifetime spent in both. When the guild system was replaced with wage labor, with patents, with the factory model of production, something was lost that we have not replaced. We can measure the frequencies inside Chartres now. We can analyze the glass with spectrometers. We can confirm that the building does precisely what the builders intended it to do. But we cannot make another one. The knowledge of how to make another one died in the suppression of the guilds, 2 centuries before we had the instruments to understand what we had lost. Whatever they were doing, it works. And we destroyed the people who knew how.